Hello, everyone. My name is Max Fawcett, and I'm the lead columnist with Canada's National Observer. On today's show, the first, to be clear, I have the distinct pleasure of having David Moscrop as my guest. David Moscrop is a man of many literary talents. He runs a very respectable Substack, works as an editor at McClellan and Stewart, and wrote 2019's Too Dumb for Democracy, which is one of my favorite Canadian political books, but unfortunately seems to get more relevant with each passing day. David, welcome.
Thank you very much. I like to joke that you never go broke betting against democracy. You're set.
And now you can even bet on it, probably on Polymarket or one of those terrible things.
You absolutely can. We should come back and do another one of these someday so I can rant about that.
No, okay, we'll pencil it in. But today we are talking about Avi Lewis and the federal NDP. I think David situates himself on the left of the spectrum. I inhabit probably somewhat closer to the center, but depends on who you ask. People in Alberta think I'm a card carrying communist. But we both have an interest in the NDP and its relevance and viability at the federal level. And I'm wondering, was it a surprise that Avi Lewis won with the margin that he did? And how do you think he's done over the first few days as federal leader?
On the question of surprise is a question of how far you go back. The start of the race and say, okay, Avi Lewis is going to win. He's going to win on the first ballot by a lot. I would have been very surprised. I expected more from the Heather McPherson campaign, to be quite honest. Incidentally, I expected more from the Rob Ashton campaign, ultimately, which sort of petered out in the new. If you had asked me 2 weeks ago, I would have been far less surprised. He had just raised so much money, and fundraising is a good proxy for pole position in leadership races. He proved to be a very capable organizer, which is no surprise, but also a good mobilizer, and also the second choice for, it seems, quite a bit of people. There's some work done on that uh, by I think Eric Grenier and co. I think so. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. The first few days, uh, I think uh, you've got to give them a lot of latitude because in those days you're just kind of figuring out where the break room is, and trying perhaps not to overreact to some of the histrionics that emerged after he had won. I'm very critical of Lewis in lots of ways, but I think some of the responses have been unreasonable. But also not to let the favorable responses to your head because there were some favorable ones too. So I think he's off to a fine start, but that's just the beginning of a very long list of things to do.
We'll get to the histrionics in a second, but what do you think NDP members saw in him? What was it that they were voting for? What was it that captured their attention over, like you say, a more well, how would I describe Heather McPherson? A safer choice, perhaps, or a more institutionally minded choice. Why did they decide to bet the farm, as small as it's gotten, on Avi Lewis?
Well, I think for the reasons that you just indicated, is that the party base, which by the way is different than the voter base of the country. This is a very important distinction that sometimes people forget. They think that a party are somehow indicative, representative of general election voters, which they are not. They're a very special breed of people, and and I say that with no malice. I say that with lots of love, but in a subsection of the voting base that is very particular. But I think that group, not exclusively, but primarily coming out of urban centers, you would expect Lewis to do very well in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, even were rejecting a safe choice. They were rejecting an institutional choice. They were rejecting a status quo NDP. They wanted someone who seemed, for whatever this means, more left, more expressly left. Someone who had an expressly left, ambitious, bold program for whatever electoral viability it may have or not, who was rejecting the establishment, and who I think both captured and reflected anger that a lot of people are feeling. And if you listen to Lewis talk recently, especially since winning, he talks about this anger and the need to sort of understand it and to echo or to mirror it back to to the population. So I think that's what the party is thinking. As a party choice, that makes a lot of sense. As an electoral choice, question mark. We don't know for sure.
Yeah, and I think that that is sort of one of the key sources of tension, the histrionics you mentioned, where you have, BC Premier David Eby, Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi, Saskatchewan NDP leader Carla Beck, all in various ways coming out and laying down markers that sort of suggest we're not really with this guy, or we have some concerns about this guy, because it feels like their political project is mostly not scaring voters. It's trying to convince voters that the NDP is safe, the NDP is a little more middle of the road than maybe they'd thought, and it feels like Avi Lewis's project is the exact opposite. That he is willing to
Yeah.
blow things up, he's willing to challenge entrenched interests in the system, and so we've seen conflict there. How do you think that's going to resolve itself? Is he going to moderate? Are they going to disavow him? Like, how does that work itself out?
So I think this is the essential question facing the federal NDP concerning its electoral viability, its future as a party, and its future as a federated party. And that third question is, I think, the one that what your setup touches on the most. So if we take the premiers, particularly Alberta, I think, and Saskatchewan, but also Manitoba and British Columbia, there's an open question about to what extent Avi Lewis is going to be able to maintain a good relationship with these premiers. And the challenge is the NDP is, with a small asterisk, the only federated party in the country. So if you become a member of the federal party, you're a member of the provincial party. If you become a member of the provincial party, you're a member of the federal. The asterisk is Alberta has now chosen to allow you to opt out, which in a sense is a kind of tip of the spear where you might expect more of that. I could see that in Saskatchewan in the coming months, or even in Manitoba theoretically. And that's because the interests vary from province to province to province. And we saw that when Rachel Notley and the late Premier John Horgan were fighting over pipelines, and Alberta didn't want to bring in British Columbia wine and so on and so forth. It's kind of a freedom fries moment. But that makes sense because the political interests and incentives and imperatives are going to vary based on the interests of the province. And so Lewis has got to find a way to manage between the province and the federal government, federal NDP, but also between the different provinces, and that's very hard to do. On that, I think he's going to have to find a way to moderate. I do think that is the way to do it, but he also can't do so without taking a position. And what Jagmeet Singh did around Trans Mountain for a long time was try to have it both ways without upsetting any province, while also trying to court federal NDP voters, and that did not work out for him well. Lewis's inclination by nature is going to be to double down and go the other way. So that party, in that sense, has a decision to make about, okay, who are you in this for? Do you want to be more viable? Do you want to go all in on the federal party and their prospects, or do you want to try to make sure that the subnational parties have a chance at governing or staying in government? And if you choose the former, are you willing to potentially lose them? Very, very tough job this guy's got right now.
Well, and it feels to me like, if he makes the same mistake as Jagmeet Singh and tries to kind of be all things to all people, or try to uphold the provincial wings, but also maintain his offer to his voters, he may end up losing on both ends.
Yes.
He may get squeezed between the sides there on that one. It'll be interesting to see, yeah, if he decides to help the provincial wings, or if he decides that it's more important to have a strong federal party and basically to heck with whatever happens in the provinces. Um, what's your sense of the NDP's prospects for recapturing the working class vote? There's been a lot of talk about that. Um, Rob Ashton was, I think, the sort of the consensus pick of the unions of the labor movement, and he didn't really get anything from it, or he certainly didn't show up in his vote totals. How does Avi Lewis approach that issue? Is it worth trying to win over the blue collar workers that Pierre Poilievre has kind of drawn away, or is there a new base that he has to create for the federal party?
Is It's funny because every question is the hardest question. There's just no question that isn't the hardest question because the is okay, what about money? And then
Mhm.
that becomes the hardest question. But on this one, I think at least to some extent you have that classic urban progressive versus not necessarily rural, but some is suburban, sometimes rural, but certainly working class riding divide. And you might very generally divide this as a kind of orange versus red challenge, where you'd worry that, okay, the Liberals and the NDP are competing for certain seats in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and so on. And then you've got the working class seats where maybe you're competing with the Liberals, but there's a good chance you're competing with the Conservatives. And I think of Vancouver Island. I think of certain parts of the East Coast, certain parts in the prairies, but certainly southwestern Ontario, somewhere like Oshawa, right? Former home of Ed Broadbent, where he had a seat for some time. And or Windsor, right? And what do you do there? And there you think Rob Ashton, not Lewis. And so I do think there's a real challenge there. And so the NDP has a question to ask itself is, okay, well, maybe if you share a kind of urban, progressive, socialist program appeals, and maybe your raw vote goes up. But if you want to win X number of seats to say get back to party status, official party status, then you start looking at the orange blue ridings like Windsor, Oshawa, and so on and so forth. And you say, okay, well, what do we do there? What do we do on, say, the gas tax? Do we cut a gas tax or not in the face of surging prices? Do on future energy projects where working class folks are like, well, I'm going to work on that project. I'm going to be a construction worker on this uh, project. I'm going to work in the facility when it's done. And then there's a choice to make. And honestly, I do not know where the party's future rests because that is such an existential, tough question. And I don't think they know either. But my kind of gut initial instinct would be to say, you're going to have to put a lot of water in your wine when it comes to this moment. Truly, that's not to say you can't have an ambitious program in some senses. We can talk about public grocery stores and so on, but on energy in particular and major projects, I'm not sure that if you want to win, you should be cutting too hard against the grain.
Yeah, I think I would have agreed with you a couple weeks ago on this one. Obviously, energy, climate, Alberta. I spend far too much time thinking about this, and
Sure.
and I have not been a fan of Avi Lewis in the past, certainly because of the whole Leap Manifesto thing. Like it's there's a lot of PTSD for Alberta New Democrats and people who want to see them succeed. But I think with what is happening right now with oil prices, with Iran, there's almost an opening for Avi Lewis and the NDP to give Canadians a different choice because you have the Liberals and the Conservatives who are both competing for the we want to build more pipelines, we want to serve the world's oil and gas needs. Tim, the energy minister. Why am I blanking on his name?
Hodgson?
Tim Hodgson. I was thinking Tim Hudak. I haven't had enough coffee today. Tim Hodgson, he has talked about especially
Hmm.
LNG in ways that sound basically indistinguishable from Joe Oliver and Harper era cabinet ministers. So there's an opening for the NDP to uh, sort of paint a different picture of the future, one where you have China and other countries in the world sort of electrifying, decarbonizing, and we can be part of that, or we can be part of the sort of Donald Trump double down on oil and gas. That feels like there's some juice in that orange for the NDs to squeeze, but it puts them right afoul of the Saskatchewan and Alberta NDP
Hmm.
provincial wing. So, like, what do you make of that theory that there's a lane there for them if they want to take it if it's done carefully?
I absolutely think there's a lane there. Also, I think there's very important policy there. I mean, if we're just talking substantively, I think, the electrification, clean energy are non-negotiables, and there's certainly the future in every sense. I mean, I think we're talking less about, paradigm shifts versus when you get with the paradigm shift and whether you want to lead it or follow it. That said, then I look at future of electric vehicles and we've now decided we're going to back off of that, for instance, and I get a little bit skeptical. It's funny in our household we've been looking to make the take the EV plunge for a while, but then we want to stay with the particular brand that we like of car, Honda. And they've just scrapped their plans,
Mhm.
right? And we look around and say, well, okay, what's that going to mean for infrastructure? And we know the infrastructure is not going to catch up. And then I start to get a little bit cynical. And what worries me about the lane, because I think you make a good point and it's plausible, is how much are people going to care because they sort of discount the future and they worry right now about gas being, a buck 80, $2 a liter. And if you call an election in the midst of that and say one of the planks is we're going to cut the gas tax,
Yeah.
um, which, tends to play fairly well. What do you do if you're, say, Avi Lewis, and then when say you're supporting decarbonization, someone says, "Well, hold on a second, you want to decarbonize, but you're all for cutting the gas tax, like pick a lane." He might fall into a
Hmm.
trap there. So I highlight that risk more than make a prognostication. Uh, so I have this feeling that the longer he's in the job, the more he's going to get savvy and political. He talks about, not really being a weasel word user and not being too much of a politician. But I find that after a while on the job, everyone becomes a little bit more of a politician and then tries to triangulate a little bit on these things. Because I do think the one of the existential points that you just put your finger on is he could lose the provincial parties.
I mean,
Maybe some people want that. Like I'm sure lots of people in the provinces are all for it, maybe in the federal party. But then it raises a lot of material questions about what do you do with volunteers, what do you do with resources and personnel, and I'm like, they can't even afford to ask these questions right now, I don't think.
yeah, I mean, I can see two lanes here, or two, two futures. I can see a future where, in 5, 10 years, the NDP is back to where it was in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And I can see a future where it doesn't exist. Um, so, from your perspective, after the next election, whenever that happens, what does success look like for the NDP? Is it a certain number of seats? I mean, I assume it's more than zero. Is it a certain amount of money that they've raised? Is it like what would be a sign that Avi Lewis's leadership has been a success?
I think the most obvious one, and if I were leader right now, this is what I'd be telegraphing, is official party status, which is to say a number of seats,
Mm-hmm.
at least 12. And that is not symbolic. I mean, it is symbolic, but it's not exclusively symbolic. It's material. You get
Mm-hmm.
official party status and you get more resources in the House of Commons, you get committee seats, you get more money, you get more time, and then you leverage that for more money. And but then also the media takes you, I think, seriously in a slightly different way. I've been talking to folks about the AP and let's say, well, once the party lost status, there was an excuse to no longer include them in certain hits or panel shows, either as official or unofficial representatives, because, well, not really, we don't include the bloc, we don't include the Greens, so they're not party. Well, the bloc is an asterisk, but it's an excuse not to include the NDP. And then, of course, you get into a kind of death spiral. Spiral. There
I
we
think
go.
you just
We've
coined a new
we've
word. Yeah,
coined the
I
death cycle.
hate a death cycle.
The hated NDP death cycle. You get into this sort of death spiral where you don't get the attention and the resources because you don't have the attention and the resources, and down you go. And so, getting back to that is really critical. And I think in that sense, Lewis has a bit of an advantage because he's very good at organizing. He's very good at mobilizing. He knows how to do this. He's been doing this his entire life. He's got a network of people around him who've been doing that for a very, very long time and who are very, very good at it. And I don't think you can discount the value of having that talent. And the one of the challenges the NDP faces right now that I think people sometimes forget about is that they just don't have the money to field the full team. Forget about talking about the depth of the bench. They couldn't afford to field the bench if they had it.
Yeah.
Like saying, okay, you're going to start the game with four skaters because you can't afford a left wing. That puts you at a disadvantage, and a serious one.
Where should they be focusing? If they're going to win 12, I don't want to get too granular here. Sound like a, curse of politics or something like
I was
that.
going
But
to say it's a
yeah,
Hurley Burley reference.
exactly. But like where could his base be? Is it in BC? Is it in, southwestern Ontario? Like where should they be putting their limited political and financial capital to work?
So this is where the answer is I don't know, and I don't think they know because you reach a paradox as soon as you start to interrogate this problem. And the paradox is, I think the most obvious viable path for that is to try to focus on those working class blue-orange type ridings that we talked about, the kind of Windsor, Oshawa, Vancouver Island, the ridings like Gord Johns' riding in on Vancouver Island and Courtney Comox area. I think there's a real opportunity to win those spaces or win them back or to grow in similar and adjacent ones, especially if people sort of get tired of Pierre Poilievre and think he's getting a little too cute by half, or we've seen his bit or whatever. But the counterpoint to that is Lewis is probably not the ideal person to do that for reasons we discussed. And so either he has to find other places, like for instance, vie against the liberals in urban centers, which is tricky in the current climate with the liberals at, in the mid to high 40s, or change his politics or approach to try to win those other ridings. And those are very difficult things to do, either of them.
Mhm.
Or you get really desperate and make what I think is objectively the wrong decision and try to do both of those things. Which is what you referenced earlier with Jagmeet Singh. It was like,
Yeah.
and I think Lewis himself knows this because, when he's talking in interviews, he'll talk about how the party got kind of too cute in the past or trying to be, too many things for too many people. But I do think those are the two core paths. Again, my instinct is to go more towards those working class ridings and to find a political program that can balance the kind of aggressive left politics he wants with the fact that people have immediate material needs that need to be met right now.
What's at stake here for non-New Democratic Canadians? I guess maybe to bring you back to your book, what is the cost of Canada basically becoming a two-party country? What do we lose if we lose the federal NDP?
I love this question. I think this is one of the most important questions facing the country structurally right now. I don't think there's a lot of people meeting at Tim Hortons or McDonald's at 7 in the morning and saying, like, let's talk about the party system, right? Like this isn't kind of dinner table talk, but I think it actually kind of lingers and looms and is otherwise present. It's kind of an eminence grise where people are like, well, how's this all going to fit together? And I have been proud of Canadian multi-party democracy for a long time because I think it reflects the diversity and the disagreements along policy and other markers of the country. And one of the reasons I've advocated for PR, even though I'm less militant about it than people might think, but it is that PR can both enable match and support that diversity within a legislature, and I think that's healthy because I think the complexity of the country ideologically, regionally, linguistically, and so on uh, ought to be reflected in the House of Commons, and you can reflect that in a multi-party system much more, I think, naturally than a two-party system. Where you have big brokerage parties that start to kind of look the same, and if you don't fit into that narrow bandwidth, then you're not heard. And I think we're all the poorer for it. That said, um, there are moments when the country doesn't seem to want that, and the last election was one of those. So I, I do think there's a risk that we end up drifting towards that two-party system. That said, party systems come and they go. They're not fixed. If you go about throughout Canadian history, you see the rise and fall of parties uh, over and over and over again, and there's some health to that. It's sort of like a controlled burn almost. But I do like parties themselves. If they didn't exist, you'd have to invent them, and I think there's a natural tendency towards them. But I hope we don't have to go through that because the NDP also represents a very important tradition in the Canadian parliamentary, especially left space, that has given us nice things. And Don Davies talks about this, and Avi Lewis and other candidates have talked about this. And whenever someone says, well, like, what has the NDP ever done? And you go back through the history, and everyone talks about Medicare, but go Ed Broadbent played a very important role with the patriation of the Constitution during the global financial crisis. The NDP leaned government, very hard for more generous supports to folks. And in the last few parliaments, we saw the NDP working on dental care, pharmacare, daycare, anti-scab legislation. These things exist or exist as they are in part because of them, and that's very important.
Yeah, agreed. For a party that has never governed federally and has never really been particularly close, except for one time, the amount of influence they have over the policy architecture in our country and the things that are most core to our sense of Canadianness and our sense of well-being, Canada Pension Plan, they have New Democrat fingerprints on it. So I think that's a really important point.
Absolutely.
Last question, and this is sort of a pet theory of mine. I wonder what you think of it, but is there an opportunity to merge the Greens and the New Democrats? Is there a way to make, 1 + 1 = 3 there, or at least more than two?
This is such a funny thing because uh, the top line answer is I'm not too sure, although I think there's a more natural merge there than between, say, the Liberals and this comes up every so often. In fact, there was a semi-serious movement in the early 90s to do just such a thing with the Liberals and the NDP among serious New Democrats. It did not get uptake at scale, and
Can I
it's
just can I just jump in there? It's so funny because I was a dreaded young liberal back in the day, and
mhm.
we used to always have these conversations about, what if the NDP merge with the Liberals? And the truth is, New Democrats hate liberals more than they
Yes,
hate conservatives.
yeah.
Like the idea that they would ever be one happy political family, it just doesn't survive even the smallest test.
And there's something I want to say, and I'm just gauging how much trouble I'm going to get in and from whom. Yeah, there's a certain, I'm going to do it anyway because what do I care?
There we go.
There's a certain parallel with the degree of animosity between, say, like the Marxists, Leninists, and the Trotskyists, and the Communist Party.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Canada has like a Marxist-Leninist party and a Communist Party for reasons that I'll never fully understand. And there's a certain kind of sense of like, you guys should just be getting along at least a little bit better, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what's this?
You have so much in common, and they're like, we have nothing in common.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think the Liberals and the NDP are distinct, and I think they should remain distinct. But in that spirit, I think part of the Green NDP divide is historical and personal and personnel, that you have a hard time doing it just because they view each other with great suspicion, even though they may share a lot of natural affinities. And this is one of the things I think that move beyond ideology. And now we're not talking about ideology as much as we're talking about institutional theory, about what happens when you create these things. They take on their own distinct identities and imperatives and interests, and those things will exist above, beyond, notwithstanding any ideological affinities. They're sort of like, no, this is my space. This belongs to me. This one's green. This one's orange. This one has these people. This one has those people, and they don't go together. You might say, but what about all of these ways you agree? I'm like, yeah, but we're different, and that difference is sort of nebulous. And so there might be some use to that, electorally and otherwise. And I just think would never ever happen for all those very fascinating reasons we
No,
could talk about at length.
it's a fair point. My parents were both Marxists back in the day, and they've educated me conflicts they had between the Marxist Leninists and the Maoists, and it seems inscrutable to me. But I take the point. I guess to me it just looks like that is the cleanest shot that the NDP has at a geographically safe electoral base. Vancouver Island, parts of Vancouver. You do a Green Democrat thing. There might. I take your point. Um, what, Last question. What is the biggest challenge that Avi Lewis has as new NDP leader over the next, call it 3 to 6 months? What should we be watching for, and what should he be watching for?
I'm going to cheat a little bit on this question. Because I'm going to say the challenge is the number of challenges he faces, and that sounds a little bit cheeky and a little bit like sophistry, but it's not. I mean it. It's
Hmm.
that okay? His immediate challenges are first and foremost to raise money. That they need money. They need to keep the lights on at the Leighton Building. well, I'm in the suburbs of Ottawa, so it's not strictly speaking down the road, but let's say, down the road-ish compared to the size of the country. They got to raise money. That's job one in many senses, because without it, you can't do anything else. But simultaneously, you have to be trying to work to define the narrative and not allow the whomever to define you as a kind of fringe lunatic, which people are going to try to do. And that's going to be really, really tough. So he's got to be good at communicating and agenda setting and framing and defining himself. And he can't wait to do that. I also think he should be trying to get into the House of Commons sooner rather than later. I think it was a mistake for Jagmeet Singh to wait. It's also expensive to pay for the leader's salary while you're waiting, which the NDP is going to have a hard time doing. But that's tremendously difficult because where do you go? And then you've also at the same time have to be keeping the peace between the federal and parties and making sure those relationships are viable and ideally productive. And the problem is you have to do all of that simultaneously because you can't really do it serially. Uh, so, so at that point,
Good luck.
quantity takes on a quality all its own. That's really, really tough. But if, forced at gunpoint to choose one, honestly, I'd say money.
Yeah. To avoid the death cycle, right?
The death cycle. Yeah, I'm really glad that's catching on.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. This was fun. The first episode of I Hope Many, and thank you, David Moscrop, for joining us.
It's an honor. Thank you so much for having me. My